Isaac Hart presents Ghost in the Museum. Welcome back to the Ghost in the Museum podcast. I'm Isaac and this is episode 2. I wanted to start by saying a huge thank you to everyone who listened and downloaded episode 1, survived. It's been wonderful to hear from so many people about how much they liked it and that they've been sharing it with family and friends and spreading the word. That's really meant a lot to me. We've had nearly 50 plays in the last month, which for a brand new pod isn't too bad, so I'm very pleased with that. Like I said in the intro to episode 1, I've been meaning to start this podcast for a very long time and I kept putting it off and off, so to have this kind of response has been very special and very validating. So yes, thank you so much to everyone. It really does mean the world. So a few updates before we crack on with today's story. I've slowly been rolling out the podcast to other podcast apps besides Spotify. We're on Amazon now and Castbox, and I'm hoping to have Apple Music and the others set up soon. I'm still getting to grips with how this all works, so thank you for your patience in that regard. Still need to get the website up and running. I've been a bit busier than I was expecting this last month, so that's rather gone on the back burner. I promise I'll get round to that at some point, as that will be the main hub for all and any updates and information about the show. One more thing, you might have noticed a slight upgrade in the sound quality compared to the last episode. I've got myself a pop filter for the mic. Listening back to Survived, I couldn't help but notice a lot of mouth-related noises that weren't words, so no one seemed to mind that, but it bugged me a little. So yes, hopefully slightly clearer audio going forward. So all that's out of the way. Today's story, it's another one of my older ones. I think I had the first germ of this idea just after I finished my undergraduate degree. Again, it's taken a lot of different shapes and sizes since then before it finally turned into what it is now. I was actually staying near where this story is set, seeing a few friends right after Survived dropped, so a lot of this story is informed by that. So in a way, it's both an old idea and a new idea sort of intermingled with one another. So yeah, let's get started with this month's story, London's Burning. So much for an English summer, Jo Jones thought darkly to herself as she trudged across Southwark Bridge. As it had done every day for the last week, the drizzle had descended upon the city of London like a shroud, a grey curtain that clung to the very soul of the place. It was a wretched, miserable day, one of those days that seemed designed to test the limits of a person's patience. The streets were at a standstill, choked with cars and buses, their horns blaring in a cacophony of frustration. Their wailing reverberated through the narrow streets, crushing the spirits of weary commuters. Dishevelled, cocooned in her trench coat, Jo strode as fast as her rain-soaked boots would allow. She clutched a lukewarm coffee in one hand and an umbrella in the other, the wind doing its best to wrest both from her grip. "Give me an excuse," she muttered to herself. "Give me an excuse to finally pack it in, I swear." Jo gritted her teeth against the biting cold and groaned, her boots squelching beneath her with each begrudging step, the relentless blaring of the traffic and onslaught. On days such as these, when the London sky wept incessantly, Jo pondered whether her life's path had taken a wrong turn. Perhaps she could go back to Godalming, back to her family's charming Surrey pub and pull pints behind the bar like her sister did. Carol was making the same amount of money as her, and she didn't have to commute from Elephant and Castle every day. The thought danced at the edge of her mind, a tantalising daydream that had gone as quickly as it came. She was ensnared in her career now, a heritage professional, as her tax return so dismally put it, a city dweller by necessity, not choice. As Jo continued her soggy march over Southwark Bridge, a glimpse through the hazy veil of rain to her right caught her attention. Rising above the modern metal and glass monoliths that lined the embankment, there stood the old Sentinel, the monument to the Great Fire of London, its golden plume blinking dully as it peeked over the office blocks. When Jo had first arrived in London, a fresh-faced graduate, she had thrilled at the embarrassment of historic sites that lined her daily path to work. The Globe, St Paul's Cathedral, the Guildhall. The city was an open-air museum, a treasury of tales etched into its very stone. Yet now, a year later, the novelty had faded like an old photograph, its vibrant colours turned to sepia tones. In its place, the grinding reality of a young museum worker had taken root. A minuscule bedsit on the south side of the Thames, rented at an exorbitant price. Hours spent toiling in obscurity, performing the most tedious tasks at the Museum of London. And to top it all off, today's misery included a walk through this deluge courtesy of a tube strike that was grinding into its fourth day. As she gazed at the monument, Jo couldn't help but entertain a bitter thought that occasionally crept into her mind on days like this. A wish, half serious, that London would burn to the ground once more. The city had scorched through her youthful enthusiasm to the point that she didn't even particularly like history anymore. The old churchyard in Godalming had seemed exciting and intriguing when she was a little girl. After being battered around the head by the rain-soaked Palladian edifices of the city for over a year, St. Edmund's now seemed little more to Jo than a heap of old stones. Jo's steps quickened as she traversed the bridge, the relentless rain now a torrential downpour, soaking her through to the bone. Irritation clawed at her chest as she glanced at her phone. She was running late, and her manager, Graham, had an astonishingly little tolerance for lateness. The thought of another unamused warning from the boring little man tightened the knot in her stomach. Turning down Cannon Street, Jo joined the throngs of men and women in tailored suits, all trudging through puddles and clutching their umbrellas like shields. The city's denizens, lost in the cacophony of modern life, marched forward, eyes glued to their phones, oblivious to the world around them. Snippets of conversations floated past Jo, the hollow banter of stockbrokers and money changers. "And you need to sell them at... It's only going to go up, trust. A chance to turn it around if you talk to..." She couldn't help but wonder if these people made in a year what she would struggle to accumulate in a lifetime. Yet as she observed their furrowed brows and hunched shoulders, their faces etched with stress and discontent, she found a bitter consolation in the realisation that they appeared even more miserable than she felt. Jo slurped the last dregs of her coffee, now ice-cold, and tossed the cup in the direction of an overflowing bin. The refuse collectors were on strike too. Cutting across the gardens that lay before St. Paul's Cathedral, Jo's gaze was drawn to the great grey dome that loomed above her. Even in the drenching rain, it seemed to shimmer with an ethereal, otherworldly quality. An image from a history book she had pored over as a child flashed briefly through her mind. St. Paul's, illuminated by the raging fires of the Blitz, a dark silhouette against the dazzling whiteness of the inferno engulfing the city, as captured in a black and white photograph. Jo had ventured inside St. Paul's twice during her rare days off. Terminally single, there had been little better to do. Her solitude had seemed as stark and enduring as the stone walls that surrounded her. Rennes Cathedral was a shrine to a certain kind of triumphalism that was almost embarrassing now, all grand white columns and stoic statues of half-forgotten imperial heroes, felled by yellow fever while crushing some Indian princedom. St. Paul's was 100 times the size of St. Edmund's, yet now seemed little different to that modest village church. For all the cold stone and echoing silence, St. Paul's was as much a heap of bones and pleading inscriptions for remembrance as its humble sibling. What did any of it matter? As Jo turned away from St. Paul's, her thoughts still lingering on the cathedral, she nearly walked face first into a dark figure blocking her path. Her heart leapt within her chest and she let out an involuntary yelp of surprise. Fortunately, the relentless rain muffled her startled cry and the hurried passers-by paid her no heed. The figure before her remained unmoving, its empty, glazed eyes fixed upon her, an eerie figure in the rain-soaked streets. Jo's pulse raced, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she struggled to regain her composure. It took a few disoriented seconds for her to realise what she had almost collided with. The austere bust of the poet John Donne. Its lifeless eyes stared eastward, the direction Jo had just come from, as if eternally lost in contemplation. Shaking her head to dispel the lingering shock, Jo clutched her chest, her heart still pounding as she hurried down St. Martin's Le Grand. Memories of her childhood flooded her mind, and she couldn't help but recall a rather cruel prank her sister Carol had once played on her. One morning, as kids, Carol had waited in the silence outside the bathroom door, pulling a grotesque face poised to scare Jo when she emerged. The shock had been such that Jo had burst into tears, prompting a scolding from their parents for waking them up on a Saturday morning with their childish antics. It all felt like a distant memory now, a relic of less cynical days. Something about John Donne's visage had stirred something within Jo. The poet's own words drifted into her consciousness, half remembered from some undergraduate essay. "Never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." A shiver ran down her spine, almost involuntary. She tried to attribute it to the biting cold rather than some subconscious pang of existential dread. Jo's reverie was pierced as she found herself standing before her workplace, the Museum of London. The building before her was a testament to the bizarre architectural choices of the 1970s, an unsightly concrete monstrosity that squatted like a stranded UFO in the middle of a roundabout, carelessly bisecting the line of the ancient Roman wall. The rain, having served its tormenting purpose, chose this moment to cease, dwindling into a feeble drizzle. Of course, Jo muttered under her breath. With a quick glance left and right, she dashed across the road and sought refuge beneath the immense concrete canopy of the museum's entrance. She shook her umbrella vigorously, sending droplets scattering in all directions, and then fumbled in her bag for her lanyard. Her fingers finally found the thin plastic card, and when she examined it, the sight of her own smiling, bespectacled photograph on the keycard elicited a grimace. It was a stark reminder of how her enthusiasm for her role as the Principal Assistant Archival Transcription Project Officer had waned over time. Museum jobs these days seem to revel in verbosity, using as many words as possible when the title archivist would have more than sufficed. Jo tapped her keycard against the glass door of the museum, which responded with a polite bleep and slid open. She sighed in relief as she stepped inside, leaving the damp London morning behind her. Stripping off her sodden trench coat with an audible squelch, Jo couldn't hide her disgust at the sensation of wet fabric against her skin. She trudged over to the reception desk, her expression a mix of discomfort and resignation. "Morning, Zainab," Jo greeted the receptionist, a woman her own age and the closest thing she had to a friend in the city. Zainab, her hijabbed head resting on her hand and a look of utter boredom on her face, replied in kind, equally unenthusiastic. "Morning, Jo." Jo signed in, the two women engaging in banal small talk. "Tube strike still going on, I see," Zainab said, taking in Jo's bedraggled appearance. Jo raised her arms in a shrug. "Nah," she deadpanned. "Just felt like going for a stroll in the pissing rain." The ghost of a grin flicked across their faces at the joke. It had been clear to both Jo and Zainab that they were caught in the same web of daily drudgery, tethered to their jobs in the city. If anything, Jo couldn't help but think that Zainab had drawn the shorter straw. Her academic grades had been better than Jo's, yet somehow she had found herself relegated to the reception desk, while Jo, at the very least, was engaged in actual conservation work, however tedious it might be. Before parting ways to commence their respective tasks, the two women exchanged what they hoped were encouraging smiles. It was a fleeting connection in the midst of their isolated routines, a reminder that they weren't entirely alone in their scrabble for a meaningful career. Jo crossed the ground floor of the museum, an unsettling landscape of disarray. A week had passed since the Museum of London had closed its doors to the public, and the exhibits had been packed away, their contents waiting to be consigned to the obscurity of storage. Jo wended her way through a labyrinth of packing crates and half-disassembled displays, her steps echoing in the cavernous space that usually echoed with the babble of school trips and tourists. The museum was relocating to a new site in Smithfield, just a 10-minute walk away past the Barbican. Jo had seen the designs for the new museum, an ambitious glass and metal structure with asymmetrical lines, like a great uncut diamond. It was, she mused, a slight improvement of the concrete carbuncle they were currently in, but she couldn't shake the feeling that, by the time it was completed, it would be as dated as the skyscrapers that loomed over the city. 20 years from now, they'll demolish that too, she thought to herself, and the whole thing will start all over again. Someone somewhere was making a fortune from it all, Jo mused. It certainly wasn't the local council. The last round of funding they received had barely paid for refurbishing the fridges at the snack bar. The new museum was not slated to open for another 4 years, or so they'd been told, which, given the history of construction projects in the city, Jo figured would translate to 7 years or more, a decade at most, and at 3 times the projected budget. In the meantime, she, Zainab and the rest of the cadre of young museum professionals had received very polite emails from the curator informing them that their contracts would not be extended. The prospect of another stretch of months spent hunched over a laptop in a public library, applying to countless jobs and scraping by with temp work in some nondescript office filled Jo with a sense of despair and resignation. For every small step forward that she took in her career, it seemed that there were 5 steps back and 2 hops sideways. The image of her parents' pub in Godalming swam into focus once more. Jo couldn't help but contemplate it as she reached for the door marked staff only. Perhaps it was time to return in defeat, to start pulling pints with her sister Carol and reconnect with that nice but slightly dull boy Reese that she had dated for a couple of months in college. He was a plumber now, she remembered, and went on lots of nice holidays if his Facebook was anything to go by. It would be a stable, secure life, Jo thought, but passionless. But why worry about that? She asked herself, sinking even deeper into her own thoughts. Haven't you already lost your passion? She sighed, as she clanked her way down the curling metal steps that led down into the basement of the museum, to the stores where she worked. The natural light of the glass-fronted entrance gave way to the sickly pale yellow glow of LED lights, the faint incessant buzz filling the quiet like a persistent fly. Everything seemed to irritate Jo today, she thought, as she grumbled inwardly. She was tired of feeling like this all the time. After navigating her way through the labyrinthine storage rooms, where shelves disappeared into the gloom and forgotten objects of exhibitions past gathered dust, Jo finally reached the cramped office at the far end. Graham, her manager, sat there at his desk, his shiny bald head blinking in the electric light, the glow from his 2 computer screens casting a pallor on his glasses. "Good morning, Joanna," Graham smiled, his flat voice as dull as everything else about him. "You're 5 minutes late again." Jo could barely muster the energy to mask her irritation with Graham anymore. She had just 1 more month to endure at the museum, so what did it matter, she mused silently. "Good morning, Graham," Jo replied curtly, hanging up her sodden coat and sinking into her office chair. "Sorry, Tube still isn't running." Graham leant back in his chair, stroking his chin with the air of a man deep in thought. "Well, maybe tomorrow you could leave 5 minutes earlier. Leave enough time," he mused. Jo, her face safely hidden behind her monitors, squeezed her eyes shut in pain frustration as she simmered over the arduous 45-minute walk in the relentless rain that had begun at 7:30 that morning. Graham embodied everything that Jo had come to resent about working in museums. He'd been with the Museum of London since the 1980s, seemingly strolling into a secure, well-paid position fresh out of his degree and never leaving. He was complacent, far less humorous than he believed himself to be, and utterly unable to relate to the younger, more recent graduates. He was the type of man who thought millennials couldn't afford homes because they bought too many avocados. "Good thinking, Graham," Jo deadpanned, burying her urge to snap back. "Don't know why I didn't think of that." "You're welcome," Graham replied, obliviously. Jo sighed, logging into her emails and pulling up the list of tasks she had been steadily working through for the last few months. "So, what work do you want me to prioritise today?" Jo asked, trying to shift her mind into work mode. Graham hardly looked up. "You need to finish transcribing the remaining oral history tapes. The woman from the British Library is coming to collect them at the end of the week," he drawled. Jo, who had just settled into her office chair, heaved herself to her feet with an exaggerated sigh. She forced herself to muster a faux perkiness. "Well, I'd better get started right away then," she replied. Graham gave her a dim smile, entirely unaware that Jo was leaping at the chance to spend the day as far away from him as possible, just to avoid 8 hours of his inane small talk about the various parking disputes on the street where he lived. Jo knew more about the movements of the cars on Harding Road than she did about anything else she'd ever learned in university, and she didn't care to find out how much more there was still to discover about the temporary traffic lights at the end of Graham Street. Jo gathered her few ring binders and swiftly exited the office. Jo exited the office, leaving the realm of fluorescent lights and workplace politics, and ventured further into the murky depths of the basement. She passed through the tall, half-empty shelves that once housed the museum's archives, most now already in storage at the British Library. It was one of those spaces where the lights were motion-activated as a money-saving measure. Jo always hated the fact that she had to stride into the darkness and endure those dreaded few seconds between the light behind her switching off and the light in front of her flickering to life. In that brief oppressive moment she would be shrouded in complete darkness. She even slowed her pace deliberately so as not to outstrip the light. Once, during that disorienting interval, she had collided with Graham, who had been standing utterly still, engrossed in reading a label on one of the boxes. Jo couldn't remember exactly what name she had shouted at him when the lights switched back on, but she knew they had been sharp and she should probably count herself lucky she wasn't sacked on the spot. Perhaps that was why she had been so startled when she had bumped into the John Donne statue that morning, Jo reflected. She loathed the dark, and she detested surprises. Her nerves were frayed enough as it was. Now, as she reached the other side of the basement, she felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had not been plunged into the oppressive blackness this time. Jo tapped her keycard against the door that led to the tape room. With a soft bleep and a click, she entered the room and unceremoniously deposited the ring binders on the cluttered desk with a thud. The door, on a timed spring mechanism, slowly curled shut behind her, sealing her into the small chamber with an audible click. Jo was now alone in the room, and she let out a sigh of relief. Finally some peace and quiet, and a chance to actually focus on her museum work. Right, now where was I? Jo muttered to herself as she flicked on the desk lamp and pulled the bulb over the ring binder. She began to flip through the pages, trying to locate where she had left off, her fingers skimming over the pages filled with accession papers. These were not pristine originals, but rather fuzzy, overexposed photocopies produced on some creaking old photocopier at the turn of the millennium. The actual originals were nowhere to be found now, according to Graham, so these imperfect duplicates served as the only evidence that they had ever existed at all. In the days before computers, prehistoric times to Jo, who was younger than the photocopies themselves, whenever a new object entered the museum's collections, a standard pro forma would be filled out. More often than not, this task fell to one of the curator's underlings. The form detailed what the object was, its size and shape, its provenance, who had brought it in, and of course, assigned it an all-important accession number. This number was the key to locating the object among the hundreds of thousands of artefacts that had cluttered the museum's shelves over the years. The accession papers Jo was perusing now related to oral history tapes. In 1981, the Museum of London had launched a community initiative to commemorate 40 years since the Blitz. Elderly individuals were encouraged to bring in everyday objects from that era and be interviewed on tape about how these objects were connected to their wartime experiences. The material gathered was intended for one of those charming community-focused exhibitions that Jo had come to despise. Her inner snob always felt that the museum was pandering when it pursued projects like this. She visited museums for Roman statues and medieval paintings, not for hatpins and bars of soap. Finally, Jo found the page she had been searching for. There was just one more tape left to transcribe. Thank God, she thought to herself, her sense of relief palpable. If she had to listen to one more long-deceased granny prattle on about how her hairbrush had seen her through many a long night in an Anderson shelter, Jo feared she might lose her mind. Jo leaned closer to the accession paper, her voice steady as she read aloud. Right then. Accession number E123-70114-B. Object type, audio cassette tape. Accession date, 11/10/81. So far, everything seemed standard, and Jo thought little of it. Her eyes then dropped to the untidy handwriting on the paper, and to her dull surprise, she recognised it as Graham's handwriting. He must have been the one filling these out back when he was just a volunteer at the museum. Jo couldn't help but wonder why Graham hadn't taken on the transcribing project himself. After all, he should at least be able to read his own abysmal handwriting. As she read further, Jo teased out the short description Graham had written 4 decades earlier. Contents of cassette tape. Oral history interview. Subject Mr. Jack Stone of Cheapside, age 69. Interviewer Bill Howard, project lead. Contents of interview. Jo paused abruptly, her brow furrowing in confusion. She must have misread that part, she thought. She squeezed her face in concentration, reading and rereading Graham's faded scrawl describing the contents of the interview. The writing, though untidy, was unequivocal. Contents of interview. Object E123-70114-A. Shard of photographic plate. Mr. Stone saw Oliver Cromwell on 29th December 1940. It was written so matter-of-factly, with so much left unexplained in the air. A chill ran up Jo's spine, despite her best efforts to suppress it. Her gaze darted to the shelf before her, where, sure enough, the last tape remained to be played. A battered cassette tape in a cracked plastic case, its label curling with age. E123-70114-B. J. Stone, was scrawled on the label's edge. Jo froze, her eyes locked onto it, the faint hum of the electric light seeming to grow louder in her ears. Along with the unease came something she hadn't felt in a long time, a pang of excitement. Hadn't she just been complaining to herself about how boring these tapes were? This Mr. Stone was likely to ramble on for 20 minutes about how he'd gotten drunk during an air raid and had bumped into Cromwell's statue outside the Houses of Parliament, she reasoned, just like she'd bumped into John Dunn's that very morning. It might actually be a funny one to end the project on. Jo reached for the tape, cracked open the case, and slid it into the cassette player. With a satisfying analogue clunk, she pressed play. The air in the small office was filled with the crackling sounds of the old tape. Abruptly, the audio burst to life with a loud pop, making Jo jump in her seat at the unexpected burst of volume. It seemed as if the recording had started mid-sentence. "For coming in today, and can you give us your name?" said a plain, low voice, presumably Bill Howard.
"What?
answered the second voice, the high, reedy voice of an old man. Your name, sir, just for the tape, Bill repeated patiently. There was a moment of silence, and then the second voice, louder and more guttural than before, as if its owner was leaning into the recorder as he spoke, replied, John Stone, Jack. And when were you born, Jack? Bill inquired. 1912, the old man replied. I don't know the date. Joe remembered with a start that she was supposed to be transcribing this interview. She paused the tape, grabbed a sheet of paper, and rewound it back to the beginning, ready to start transcribing. As the tape continued, it sounded close and muffled, as if the interview took place in a small room filled with furniture. Joe wondered if it might have been one of the cramped offices upstairs. Thank you, and can you tell us what brought you into the museum today? Bill asked. There was a pregnant pause in the tape before Jack spoke again. His voice sounded as if he had smoked 10 packs of cigarettes a day for 50 years. He had a slurred East End accent, the kind Joe had only ever heard in old newsreels. No one alive seemed to speak with the accent Jack Stone had. Jack smacked his lips before responding. I have bought a piece of photographic plate. It was part of a whole plate, but it was smashed during the bombing. Was it a photograph of someone you knew? Bill inquired, his voice full of curiosity. No, replied Jack, his words harsh. Then was it your photograph? Bill continued. No, Jack repeated, after another long pause. Bill, seemingly at a loss for what to say next, finally asked, And why have you brought this to us today, Jack? Because I don't want it anymore, Jack answered, his voice teetering between irritation and pleading, and I can't throw it away. It's priceless. I need you to take it. Please, please take it. Joe was transfixed by the audio. Jack seemed so reluctant to even speak into the recorder, let alone divulge the reason behind his urgency to be rid of a shard of glass plate. Joe's curiosity had been piqued to an irresistible level. She paused the tape, and the office returned to an unsettling quietness. Her eyes flicked back down to the accession paper, specifically the number of the object that Jack Stone had brought into the museum. A burning question gnawed at her. Could it still be here? Had it already been shipped off into storage? Joe couldn't resist the urge to find out. She rose from her chair and clicked her way out of the office. The door initially refused to unlock, causing her heart to plummet. The aging electronic lock had an unpredictable tendency to seize up, threatening to trap her in this remote corner of the basement. Joe tapped her key fob against the sensor again, this time with more force, and the door sprung open. With brisk determination, Joe walked down the long shelves of the basement, no longer bothering to keep pace with the motion-activated lights. She strode into the darkness, repeating the accession number to herself like a mantra. E123-70114-A, 70114-A, 114. The shifting lighting seemed to pulse before her eyes, and for a split second, the statue of John Donne appeared to pulse before her eyes as well, its rain-soaked visage materialising like a flash of a camera. Another of his lines flashed into Joe's mind too. Death, be not proud. She shook her head, determined to stay focused as she reached the shelf she was looking for. 114-A, A, Joe repeated, running her fingers along the curled labels on a set of cardboard boxes. There it was. She pulled down the crumpled box labelled E123, Blitz Memories Project 81. Joe knew she wasn't strictly supposed to rummage through the boxes without permission, but an inexplicable urgency gripped her. After all, when would anyone else go looking for this box ever again? She sifted through the fragile, scrunched-up newspapers used as filler for the box, her fingers deftly searching. Finally, she found what she was looking for, a tiny, small black box made of balsa wood with the accession number she sought stamped on its side. As Joe clutched the small black box, the overhead light suddenly switched off, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her and she jumped to her feet, frantically waving her arms in the air, hoping to activate the motion sensor. It took longer than usual to come back on, 10 excruciating seconds of complete darkness. In that void, a cacophony of horrible memories rushed through her mind. The image of Carol standing outside the bathroom door with that grotesque face, the silhouette of St. Edmund's from her childhood bedroom window, and Jack Stone's trembling voice repeating, "It's priceless. Please, please take it." Finally, the light clunked back on. Jo stood there, trembling, grateful to find herself alone. She hastily replaced the lid of the cardboard box, heaved it back onto the shelf, and briskly made her way back to the tape room. As she reached the door, she turned to look back, watching the lights rapidly switching off along the rows of shelves, as if the darkness was chasing her, threatening to engulf her. Jo clicked her fob against the door, but it didn't open. Frustration welled inside her again. "For the love of," she swore. The lock had seized up again and the lights were nearly all off. Jo gave the door a sharp kick and with a polite bleep, it unlocked. She darted back into the tape room, slamming the door shut without waiting for the springs to guide it slowly back into place. She slumped back at the desk, her heart racing. After a moment to collect herself, Jo brought the small black box under the lamp's glow. Her hands trembled slightly as she carefully slid open the thin lid. She couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment when she saw what was inside. Nestled on a small bed of packing straw was a thin shard of nearly translucent glass, shaped like an icicle. It was minuscule, hardly 2 centimetres long and 1 wide. With delicate movements, Jo pulled on a pair of white conservator's rubber gloves from a box at the far end of the desk and gingerly picked up the shard, holding it up to the lamp's light. Upon close examination, a set of faint black impressions on the glass appeared to resemble an eye, though only in the most abstract of forms. To Jo's trained eye, it resembled the fragile daguerreotype photographs of the mid-19th century more than anything from the Second World War. She studied the shard intensely, attempting to tease out as much detail as she could. The black smudges swam before her like a Rorschach test, inviting more questions than answers. The eye could have been expressing any emotion, or none at all. Jo carefully returned the shard to its box, neglecting to replace the lid, leaving the enigmatic eyes staring out from the straw. She picked up her notepad once more, rewinding the tape slightly, and pressed play on the tape player to continue her transcription. There was nothing obvious about the shard that could explain why Jack Stone had been so desperate to be rid of it, so Jo had no choice but to keep listening. The tape resumed, and Jack Stone's voice echoed from the past. "Please, please take it," he repeated. Jo confirmed that she was picking up where she had left off. There was a pause on the tape, and it seemed that Bill was shuffling uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "We'd, be glad to, Jack," Bill said, seemingly eager to change the subject. What do you do, Jack, or did do? Are you retired?" Jack took a shaky breath, his voice ill and wheezing. He spoke slowly and heavily. "No job," he replied bluntly. "Homeless. No home since the war." Jo could almost hear Bill's jaw drop like a fish out of water. "You've been homeless for 40 years? Bill asked, shocked. More silence followed, and Jo could envision the wizened, desiccated old man nodding, his face bearing the marks of decades spent on the streets. "I live in the shelter in Cheapside now. Before that, the streets mostly. I used to work in antiques," Jack revealed. Jo was taken aback by this revelation, and Bill on the tape seemed equally surprised. "You worked in antiques?" Bill inquired incredulously. "Had an antique shop," Jack replied, his voice heavy with the weight of memories. "All blown to smithereens by the Germans." Jo's transcription notes were filled with furious scribbles as she listened intently to Jack as he began to unfold his story. The fringes of the tale of the glass shard were starting to come into view, and it was far from the light-hearted anecdote she had anticipated. What any of this had to do with Oliver Cromwell remained a mystery. "My pa died in the Great War at Mons when I was just a nipper. Ma died in the Great Flu in 19 when I was 7. I had no brothers or sisters, they all died young, so I went to St. Catherine's, the orphanage. The nuns used to whip us something dreadful, and there was never enough to eat." Bill's voice conveyed genuine sympathy as he responded. "That sounds very hard, Jack." "It was hard, life was hard," Jack replied curtly. Bill continued his line of questioning, asking, "Were you adopted?" "No," Jack responded. "It wasn't the type of orphanage you were adopted from. I was kicked out at 16. In 28, I started doing jobs for a man called Culpepper. He owned a junk shop on Bread Street." "Bread Street?" Jo noted as she scribbled down the details. She'd walked past Bread Street earlier that morning on her way to the museum, in between the monument and the gardens of St. Paul's, where she had run into John Donne's statue. Jack went on. The crash happened in 29, and all of a sudden all sorts of folks who'd been well off weren't anymore. They were selling off all their things to buy a meal. What good's a crystal set when you can't buy bread? He let out a high, cackling laugh that sent shivers down Jo's spine. It was a cruel, mirthless laugh, devoid of any humour. Undeterred, Jack continued his story. Soon the shop was full of vases and clocks and all manner of nice things, and soon it wasn't a junk shop no more. Mr. Culpepper wasn't selling junk. He was E. Culpepper and Associates, Antiques and Furnishings. All very grand it was. And there I was, an orphan boy from Cheapside, and I was Associates. You work with Culpepper in his antique shop? Bill inquired. Jo had almost forgotten the presence of the interviewer, so engrossed was she in Jack's tale. I was his buyer, Jack continued, his voice tinged with something between pride and disgust. He was very unscrupulous, was Mr. Culpepper. Whenever families fell behind on rent or got kicked out or some old bird died and didn't have no family about, he'd send me out to clear out their lodgings of anything he could sell. I made a living off it for 10 years or more. It wasn't a nice business, lad, but they weren't nice times. As Jo continued to listen to Jack Stone, her distaste for the man deepened. He came across as callous and unpleasant, exploiting vulnerable people for his own gain. She sensed that Bill shared her sentiments, even if he tried to hide his disdain. That does sound very unscrupulous, Bill commented, his voice strained, struggling to hide his judgment. Jack let out that same unsettling laugh. I know what you think of me. Can see it on your face, lad. Or is it my face? I know it isn't pretty to look at. You haven't looked me in the eye yet. But I'll tell you, lad, I'll tell you how I came to look so frightful, because it's the same story as why I lost my shop, and the same story as why I got this shard here today. Jo abruptly pressed the pause button on the tape player, her heart racing. Jack Stone's words echoed in her mind. What was wrong with his face? Why couldn't Bill look at him? The room seemed to grow darker, shadows creeping in from the shelves outside, leaving only the small desk lamp to illuminate the shard photographic plate with the eerie eye. She tried to shake off her unease, reminding herself of her own situation. I got £9,000 in debt to sit in a basement and listen to creepy dead people, she muttered to herself, a mix of frustration and realisation coursing through her. Decisiveness surged within her. She had had enough. She would finish this shift, complete this last tape, and then inform Graham that she was done, finished. Her contract was already nearing its end. What could he do? Fire her again? Jo couldn't help but snort derisively at the thought. Screw it, she muttered, reaching for the play button on the tape player. She was determined to finish this job, and it would be her last. Bill's voice filled the dark room, and Jo couldn't help but sense his growing unease too. Yes, Bill said, his voice betraying his discomfort. You were saying that the shard isn't yours? Jack chuckled ominously. I'm getting to that, lad, but you're right, it's not, and I'll tell you how I comes to have it. Jo could hear the creaking of furniture on the recording, as if Jack was settling back into his chair. The old man cleared his throat with a revolting, phlegm-filled cough, the sound seemingly emanating from the tape itself, assaulting Jo's senses with the imagined stench of cigarettes and cheap booze. It was 1940, Jack began, just after Christmas. The Germans had given London a proper pounding, I'll tell you that, lad. Nowadays, everyone gets all gooey-eyed about them days, the Blitz. They say it was a time when we all mucked in, we all got together, but it's a lie. They were the worst days. It was cold, it was dark, all the buildings were bombed to smithereens. You'd step over arms and legs and bits of brain just to hop on a bus. Jo's revulsion deepened. Jack's words painted a grim picture of a nightmare London. She could almost see the smoking, rubble-strewn streets filled with bleeding, weeping people in tattered clothes. You were caught up in the Blitz? Bill asked, attempting to steer the interview back to its intending topic. We all were, Jack replied, but I kept out of it, see? I lived in lodgings in Southwark on the South Bank. No shelter, so we used to go down the tube or into the cellar. Didn't want to be out on the street at night, for there was an even chance you wouldn't come back the next morning. A sickening realisation washed over Jo. Jack Stone had made the same commute she had made earlier that very morning. She could envision the young Jack, striding through the fog and the drizzle, his face cruel, his hair slicked back, his attire one of those crumpled brown suits she had seen in old newsreels. "And what did you do in the morning, Jack?" Bill asked, probing further. "Were you still working for the antique shop?"
"I was,"
Jack replied. There was a wicked glee in the way he spoke, as if he revelled in his own sinister actions. The furniture on the tape creaked again, and Jack's voice grew louder, as though he was leaning closer to Bill, whispering conspiratorially.
"Me and old Mr. Culpepper,"
Jack whispered,
"we had this marvellous scheme, you know. When the Germans would blow everything to bits, all the fire crews would come out, you see. They'd be dousing the flames through the early hours until dawn when the Luftwaffe flew off. Then they'd move on to other fires, not enough wardens to go around, you see."
Jack smacked his lips, sounding terribly proud of the horrific scam he was describing.
"So there'd be a little window, lad, a little window of time after the fire crews left, but before the owners of the house, if there were any left, came back to see the damage."
The air in the room on the tape felt tense, and Bill finally spoke up, his voice barely audible. "What did you do, Jack?" Jo could almost imagine the twisted grin on Jack's face, that terrible, horrible face she could hardly imagine, as he responded, his words dripping with sadistic satisfaction.
"I'd sneak in,"
Jack admitted,
"in the wee hours, have a pick through the rubble, see if there are any nice bits and bobs for the shop. Oh, lad, we found so many lovely things, and we didn't have to spend a brass farthing. It was just out in the air, free to scoop up. The shop was doing very, very well of it."
Jo's revulsion for Stone was complete. She could picture the sly, pointy young man, moving furtively through the smoke-filled streets. He would scrabble up piles of shattered masonry, picking his way over glass shards and lifeless limbs protruding from the rubble like tree trunks. Ignoring the lifeless forms, he would rifle through the stones, stumbling upon lacquered Victorian cabinets, porcelain fireplace tiles and boxes of jewellery. The image of the heartless young man casually pulling a gold wedding band from a limp, accusing finger sent shivers down Jo's spine. He would then vanish into the smoke like a remorseless ghost, leaving behind a trail of misery. Bill's voice, still tinged with disgust, continued to press Jack for more details. "You robbed houses," Bill repeated, his words heavy with judgment. Jack, seemingly unfazed by Bill's judgment, responded with a twisted sense of humour.
"Is it? Can you rob a dead man?"
His words struck at Jo. She couldn't help but wonder how someone like Jack Stone had avoided facing the consequences for his actions. Bill, however, remained persistent in his questioning. "What happened, Jack? What happened just after Christmas 1940? Jack let out a long, gurgling sigh before continuing.
29th December it was. The second great fire of London, they called it later on. Oh, it was dreadful, lad. The whole city was aflame. I was down in the cellar, and I could feel the heat blowing in through the little window that led onto the street. A firestorm it was, roasted hundreds of poor old sods alive.
Jo couldn't decipher whether Jack was horrified or amused by the memory of people burning to death. Jack went on, recounting the horrific events of that day.
The next morning, the whole city was a ruin. There wasn't a soul about. Perfect, I thought. I can get to work. So, I'm heading towards the bridge, right? I do my best work in the city in Whitechapel. But then...
Jack trailed off, his voice filled with an unsettling mixture of dread and fascination.
But then,
he continued,
I see it. Not 100 yards from where my lodgings was. A great smoking crater, lad, right where this grand old townhouse had been. I'd passed it every day and thought, cool, wonder what presents they've got in there. Now, Mr. Culpepper had always had a rule, you see. Don't go plying your trade on your own patch, Jack, my lad. The coppers will scoop you up. But I'd been doing what I did for a while, lad. I suppose I'd gotten greedy.
Jack laughed again, but this time it was different, His laughter held a note of distress, of disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend his own actions all of a sudden.
I thought, what's the harm of just taking a peek?
Jack's voice continued.
I checked there was no wardens about, and then I scrambled up this great pile of stones. I had a lot of practice, you see. I could climb without getting my hands and my feet on the glass and the twisty bits of metal. The whole house was a wreck. Looked like one of the incendiaries had gone right through the roof, gutted the place, from the roof all the way down to the cellar. But at first, lad, I thought it was a bit of a busted flush. I was turning over bricks and there wasn't anything worth anything coming up. I realised the place must have been empty. There'd been no one there. Thought I'd wasted a perfectly good morning, I did.
Jack's breath caught in his throat, leaving a chilling silence on the tape. Jack? Bill finally asked.
That's when I saw it,
Jack responded, his voice low, filled with suspense.
Sitting there, near the bottom of the crater. A box. Black. Wooden. Old rusty hinges. About this tall by this wide.
Joe pictured Jack holding his hands apart to indicate the box's size.
At first, I thought it was a jewellery box some lady left behind in the house, which suits me fine. If people are going to be leaving their valuables for someone like me to pilfer, they've got it coming, that's what I think. But then I'll pick it up, you see? And I could see, lad, right away that it was old. Proper old. You see, lad, Mr. Culpepper wasn't a complete rotter by trade, and he did know a thing or two about dating antiques, and he taught me so I could sort the real ones from the fakes. And this box, I knew right away, lad. It was 17th century, no question about it. The staining on the wood, the hinges, the little patterns on the lid.
Joe had stopped transcribing, lost in Jack's story. Bill's voice interrupted her thoughts. 17th century? He asked, clearly astonished.
I'll bet my life on it,
Jack responded confidently.
And that's when I realised that I might just have struck it rich. You're an historian, ain't you?
Jack suddenly asked Bill. Bill hesitated before replying, well, but Jack cut him off, laughing.
You remember that chest of old jewels those workmen found under the goldsmith shop before the Great War?
Bill made a noise of realisation. The Cheapside hoard, yes, we've got it here at the museum. Jack laughed again, his tone filled with a dark glee.
Those workmen tried to fence that, you know. All those rubies and diamonds and great fat emeralds. The only reason you've got it here is that the fence sold it on to you lot. That's where all museums get their stuff from, though, isn't it? People steal it, and then they give it to you, and you lot put it in a case and say it belongs to everyone.
Bill tried to object, but he couldn't quite bring himself to disagree. Joe felt a wave of unease. Jack's words cut through her like a knife. The wretched old man was right. She'd come to realise that for herself since she'd graduated. If museums emptied themselves of all the objects in their collections which were obtained illegally, their shelves would soon be as bare as those down in the basement with her.
I was holding the box, turning it around in my hands, he continued, and that's when I started thinking. Now, usually what I'd do is that after I'd done my morning's work, I'd bring all the goodies I'd picked up back to the shop for Mr. Culpepper to appraise. But he was out that day, you see. He'd left London, visiting his sister in Kent or something like that for the holidays. But he told me to just leave what I'd found in the shop and he'd go through them after New Year's. But...
Jack's voice trailed off, and Bill seemed to understand the unspoken thoughts that hung in the air. But then you thought... What Mr. Culpepper doesn't know can't hurt him? Bill said, his voice filled with a shamed understanding. Jack laughed triumphantly.
Ah, my lad, it's like you've known me for years, he exclaimed. That's exactly what I thought. I told you Culpepper wasn't entirely a rotter. Well, I was, Jack hissed, sending a shiver down Joe's spine like never before. If this box was what I thought it was, there's no way in hell that I'd just give it over, especially if he never knew I found it in the first place. I could cut out the middleman, I thought, and keep all the loot for myself. Old Culpepper was getting on a bit, I thought, and he weren't in the best health, so I thought I'd better start making deals for myself.
Joe stared at the box, with the shard of photographic glass in it. her curiosity growing stronger. The eye on the shard seemed to intensify, its gaze filled with a growing fury. What was it that Jack had found in that box? His earlier words echoed in her mind. "Please, please take it," she muttered to herself. "Why did you take it at all, Jack? What's so bad about it that you don't want it anymore?" The atmosphere in the room seemed to grow heavier, the darkness outside the door deepening. Jack's words painted vivid images in Joe's mind as he described his hurried escape from the burning ruins, the box clutched tightly under his arm.
"I'd stood there way longer than I usually did, you see," Jack explained, his voice filled with a hint of urgency. "I heard the wardens coming back, so I scarpered. I was very good at scarpering, lad, and I slid down the rubble with the box under my arm, and quick as a flash, and I was up the stairs and back into my room." Joe imagined young Jack sliding down the heap of bricks, stones scattering about his feet, while the sounds of raised voices grew louder through the thick smoke. Joe thought that she knew where this house once was, redeveloped now, a sleek block of ruinously expensive flats overlooking the Thames, in between the Tate Britain and the Globe. Joe could see Jack now, clattering up the sagging wooden staircase of whatever squalid lodging house he lived in, the box clutched under his arm, like one of those dreadful weasel-like creatures she'd seen on nature documentaries that snatches eggs from mother birds and then scuttles off to its nest to eat them. "I locked the door," Jack continued, "and I laid out the box on my desk. It wasn't a pretty room, lad, just a bed and a desk and a few chairs, but I had a lovely view, I'll tell you that much. There were a little window over the desk, and you could see all of the city laid out in front of you, St. Paul's and all. I remember I looked up, and the whole place looked as if it was smouldering, great plumes of smoke going high, high up into the sky."
Jo recalled her own walk by St. Paul's that morning, where she had imagined it during the Blitz. The room felt increasingly isolated, her connection to Jack's story deepening. She was starting to feel as if her own experiences were merging with his, as if she were witnessing these events herself, the very streets she walked every day now haunted by the spectre of Jack Stone in his box. "What did you do with the box?" Bill asked, his curiosity now overcoming any fear in his voice.
"I set it down on the desk," Jack said, "and I set about prying the lock open. Oh, it took some doing, lad, I'll tell you that. I had to use 3 different skeleton keys to prise it off, but prise it off I did. It just went click, thump, and off it came."
Joe's breath caught in her throat. The sound he described, the click, thump. It was eerily reminiscent of the door-locking mechanism to the tape room. Bleep, click, click, thump. Her heart pounded in her chest and she glanced nervously at the door to the tape room. Silence lingered for a moment before Bill's voice, filled with anticipation, cut through the tension. "And what was inside, Jack?" Jack's response was almost a whisper, but it echoed through the room, chilling Jo to her core.
"Glass, lad," he said, his voice barely audible. "Glass plates. About 24 of them."
"Glass plates?" Bill exclaimed, clearly astonished. Jack's voice crackled with frustration.
"I tell you, lad, I was fuming! I'd been expecting treasure, not a box of old snaps. I tell you, I could have chucked the box against the wall right then and there."
But Jack's tone shifted, and a tremor of fear crept into his words.
"Oh, lad, I should have shut the lid and flung the thing out the window, let 'em smash into 1,000 pieces, but I was greedy. Oh, greedy, nasty little idiot. I didn't want to think I'd wasted a morning's work, so I thought I'd take a quick glance at 'em. Make sure there weren't nothing valuable mixed in with them. We'd had that before in the shop. We'd be rifling through some old trunk and find an old plate of Prince Albert or something like that."
Jo's mind raced as she absorbed the words. Her gaze drifted back to the shard of glass on the desk, the eye staring back at her. It was becoming increasingly clear that this shard was a fragment of the glass plates Jack had found in the box. But even as her eyes flicked down to meet the glass shard with the eye etched into it, it seemed to have become clearer, sharper. The once dull and fuzzy ghost of a pupil coming into greater and greater focus. It glared back at her with an unsettling intensity.
I picked one of the plates up,
Jack continued, his voice heavy with fear and wonder,
and held it up to the light of the window.
Bill's curiosity was palpable, his voice barely a whisper now.
And what did you see, Jack? What was on the photograph?
Jack's voice grew even quieter, as if he were afraid that speaking the truth would make it real once more.
A man,
he said.
An old man. Thin man. With a beard. He was sat on a chair, his back to a stone wall, and he had a sheet wrapped about his shoulders. A white sheet like they wrap bodies up in.
A white sheet? Was he dead? Bill's voice inquired, probing for more details. Jack hesitated a moment before answering.
I don't know. He had his eyes shut. The whole image, it was shaky, blurry, like the man had been moving when whoever took it. But he had his eyes shut. That's what made me realise, lad. The eyes and the sheet. It's the queerest thing, lad, the queerest thing. I knew who the man in the photograph was.
Joe's mind raced, her thoughts spiralling into a maelstrom of confusion and disbelief. The way Jack described the image conjured up a face before her. The same face that she'd seen that very morning. No, Joe muttered to herself, her voice trembling with disbelief. No. Bill pressed on, his curiosity still burning. You recognised him?
I'd seen him before,
Jack said.
In St. Paul's, during a service.
Joe's heart pounded loudly in her ears. It couldn't be, she thought, her mind desperately rejecting the connection she was making, the impossible connection, the realisation like a sledgehammer to her chest. One of the men in the pews? Bill asked, trying to clarify what Jack meant. Jack's answer shattered Joe's fragile denial.
No,
he said, his voice carrying a haunting weight.
One of the men on the walls. One of the statues. The man in the glass plate, the man in the sheet with his eyes closed. It was John Donne.
Jo sat there, stunned, her breath caught in her throat. She'd seen that very statue Jack had seen. Walked past a bust of the man that very morning, the one she had collided with, John Donne, the poet, the clergyman, the man who had died in 1631, but whose likeness was now described, impossibly, in a photograph, hidden in a box on a tape, hidden in the bowels of the museum. Bill's voice remained soft, filled with scepticism. John Donne, the poet? Jack's reply came with a weight of conviction.
As I live and breathe.
The tape recorded a haunting silence, broken only by Bill's hesitant attempt to make sense of the inexplicable. But Jack, he stammered. John Donne, he lived in the Stuart era, in the reign of Charles I. They didn't have photography then. It must have been a photo of the statue. Jack's voice came back laced with anger and fear as he responded,
I'll tell you, it was the man himself. I thought the same thing you did. Thought it must be a set of tourist snaps or something. But there at the bottom of the plate, there was this writing, thin, spidery handwriting. It was scratched into the plate. It was something like the poet Donne, our studio Southwark, 3rd March, 1631. This was a photograph of Donne, lad. The oldest photograph in the world.
Jo felt her world spinning out of control. The story Jack was telling was beyond belief. Photography was invented centuries after Donne's time. and yet he claimed to have seen a photograph of the poet from 1631. It was impossible, absurd, and Jo couldn't wrap her head around it. Yet, the evidence was staring at her from the box on the desk. This wasn't Dunn's eye, she thought to herself, even as her mind sought to dismiss the whole story as the ravings of a mad old man. The eye was too cruel, too hateful to be Dunn's, the gentle, melancholy poet. Her eyes flicked back to the words on the accession form. Mr. Stone saw Oliver Cromwell on 29th December 1940, written in Graham's handwriting. Jo could feel the blood draining from her face, her mind teetering on the edge of something. "Is it you?" she whispered, staring at the furious eye. "Are you him?" The tape continued to crackle as Jack recounted the impossible images he had discovered.
"I couldn't believe it,"
Jack repeated, his voice quivering with a mixture of fear and wonder.
"I pulled out another plate, then another, and another, and every one of them, lad, every one of them shouldn't have existed. One was of an old, bald man hunched over, clutching a wizened old walking stick. Tom Parr, the old, very old man," the word said at the bottom. "I remember them clear as day. 152 years old. Our studio, Southwark, 30th of September, 1635.
Tom Parr, the man said to be born in the reign of Edward IV, the oldest man in English history. Jo's mind was reeling. The idea that Jack had looked on the face of a man born in the 15th century was beyond belief. Jack's voice continued, filled with a strange mix of dread and excitement.
"Another plate. It was a field covered in corpses. It was horrible. Dead horses and dead men, like the bodies out in the streets after the bombings. The words at the bottom, Battle at Edge Hill. Its sad remainder. 24th October, 1642. It was the aftermath of the battle, lad. A battle 300 years ago."
Jo's mind was racing with the implications of these discoveries. If Jack Stone had indeed stumbled upon a cache of photographs from the distant past, it was a historical breakthrough of unimaginable proportions. Jo could feel her excitement surging again. The prospect of uncovering more of these inexplicable images filled her with a renewed sense of purpose, her passion for history burning brighter than ever before. "Graham," Jo whispered to herself, "I'm going to take your job," a wicked grin spreading across her face. "Where'd the photographs come from, Jack?" Bill's voice asked breathlessly on the tape.
"There was a note,"
Jack replied, his voice quivering with the weight of the revelation.
"An old scrap of parchment in the box, folded in with the plates. I pulled it out to read it. Oh, why didn't I make a copy? I remember it so clearly, lad."
Jo leaned closer to the cassette player, her heart pounding with anticipation.
"To he who finds this chest," the note said,
Jack reading it with a mixture of awe and bewilderment.
"To he who finds this chest, these be the drawings made alight, created by I, Thomas Herring, alchemist, by way of the discovery made by myself in 1629 that the light of the sun blackens silver nitrate, and that this blackening maketh an impression of life upon a pane of glass. Know that I hath kept my process a secret some 30 years to guard against jealous rivals, and hath only made images of the certain men to whom I have known will keep my secret in faith or else in death."
It was an astonishing historical revelation. Thomas Herring, an alchemist from the Stuart era, had unlocked the secret of photography long before its official invention. It would rewrite history, thought Jo, and in that moment Jo could only think about the impact it would have on her own career. As she sat there, immersed in the incredible story on the tape, Jo hardly noticed the distant noise of the lights at the far end of the basement flicking on distant at first, but growing slowly, steadily louder. Bill's voice was quivering with anticipation again. "What happened to the photographs, Jack?" he asked. Jack went quiet, and Joe could hear his breath hitching on the tape.
"Before I knew it, night had fallen again," Jack said, his voice trembling. "The blackout was in effect in those days, you know. Lights out all over the city. So I had no light to see the rest of the plates. Well, sod it, I thought. What's one candle in one window? I lit one on my desk, carrying on my work. I pulled out the second to last plate, held it against the light from the candle."
Joe could sense the anxiety in Bill's voice as he asked, "What was on the plate?"
"Bodies,"
Jack whispered, his voice heavy with dread.
"Bodies on a cart, on a street, against a wooden building. The Great Pestilence, 30th April, 1665, from the window of our studio Southwark. Jesus have mercy." That's what it said at the bottom.
"The Great Plague of London," Bill breathed in disbelief. He'd been taking his photographs damn near 30 years or more. Joe was gripped by the chilling realisation of what these photographs must have contained. The horrors of the Great Plague, captured through the lens of whatever primitive device Herring had constructed to take his photographs.
"The air raid warning started blaring away. Everyone get to the shelters," the marshals were yelling. I ignored it. The Germans never hit our side of the river, I thought, and I just had one last plate to look at. Just the one last one," Jack whispered.
Joe could hear it. The warning siren blaring, the mournful droning wail filling the darkening skies, terrified people scrambling for cover, while all the while the pointy, cruel young man hunched by his candle obsessing over the impossible photographs. "The last plate," Bill breathed.
"Jack, what was on the last plate?"
Joe could hear something else now. The flicking of the lights in the basement. Someone must be moving about out there, she thought. Probably Graham, searching for something on the shelves.
"The last plate,"
Jack said, his voice quivering.
"I lifted it up against the candle and...
Bill's voice was filled with anxious anticipation. "What?" he pressed. "What was it, Jack?" A silence hung on the tape, as Joe imagined Jack's dread and fascination with what he was about to reveal.
It was the view. The view from my window,"
Jack finally croaked. Joe's mind was blank, her imagination struggling to keep up with the unfolding story. "The view from your window," Bill echoed, confusion lacing his words.
"The city. St. Paul's. Old St. Paul's," Jack clarified. "It was the silhouettes of the city, all lit up. These great gobbets of white light glowing all around the steeples and the spires."
Bill gasped, disbelief washing over him. "The Great Fire?"
"Words scratched on the plate,"
Jack continued, his voice filled with awe and dread.
"Inferno across the river, 2nd September 1666. I shall bury my plates." That's what he'd done, I realised. He'd buried the box in his cellar when the Great Fire came raging in, and he'd never come back for them, who knows why.
The tape crackled quietly for a moment. "What happened, Jack?" Bill asked in a small voice. "Where are the photographs now?" Jack was silent for a moment, the crackle of interference filling the void.
"I lowered the last plate,"
Jack said, his voice hardly a whisper.
"And I looked out the window. London was burning, lad. The city was on fire. That's when the bomb hit.
Jo sat stock still, rooted to her chair, gripping the desk until her knuckles turned white. You were bombed? Bill's voice was quivering, mirroring Jo's shock.
Incendiary. Straight down the chimney. Through the fireplace.
Jack recounted with a shudder in his voice.
Blew the house to smithereens in a second. All of a sudden, I was in the air. And it was like my whole room just went to bits. The photographs, the plates, they shattered into 1,000 pieces. That's the last thing I remember. Before I woke up in the infirmary. 1,000 pieces of glass, sparkling in the flames, and shooting straight at me.
Jo's sense of disbelief mingled with a profound sense of loss as Jack's haunting words reverberated through the tape. She'd been on the brink of an extraordinary discovery, only to realise that these precious relics of the past had been obliterated by a bomb. There would be no historic revolution, no crowning achievement. It was as if the past had taunted her with a glimpse of its secrets and then slipped through her fingers, disappearing into the ever-encroaching shadows. Jack and Bill were silent on the tape for a long time.
You don't believe me, do you, lad?
Jack finally spoke. Bill was quiet a little longer. It's unbelievable, he whispered. But I don't know why you'd make a story like that up.
Because I'm mad and old, and when I'm dead, no one will ever think of me ever again.
Jack hissed, his voice dripping with sorrow. More silence. The crackling on the tape was growing louder.
You're looking at me now, lad,
Jack growled. Jack's face, Jo thought, as her mind pulsed. What was so wrong with his face? Is that what happened to you? Bill asked. The shards from the plates. Jack suddenly cackled his mirthless laugh.
Tore my face to ribbons, they did, he crowed. I had nothing left. Mr. Culpepper dropped dead in Kent, and the old bastard hadn't left a shilling to me after all the scrounging about I'd done for him. I couldn't tell anyone what had happened, couldn't even begin. I went mad, lad. I never had a home again, and, oh, well...
The tape went silent, the sound of swishing fabric indicating that Jack was gesturing to the vile state he'd fallen into. Jo shook her head. She'd gotten nothing out of Jack's story, nothing but more disappointment, more frustration. She was done with history, done with devoting herself to the past when it gave her nothing back in repayment. Sod it, Jo swore as she rose with irritation from the desk. She scooped up her fob from the desk and tapped it against the keypad. The door didn't open. Jo tapped it again. Still nothing. Jo wrestled with the lock. The light streaming in from under the door was growing brighter, the clunk of the motion-activated lights growing louder and louder. "Graham?" Jo called out, her heart pounding. No response. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Blood was pumping through Jo's brain, images and sounds swirling around at a dizzying speed. John Dunn, Carol's face outside the bathroom door, Jack Stone sliding down a pile of rubble, dead horses at Edge Hill, dull, nice Reese, fire, flames, for whom the bell tolls. The tape continued to play, the voices crackling out into the dark room. Bill, maintaining his composure despite the bizarre and unsettling account, pressed Jack for the details about the shard. "The shard, Jack?" Bill asked, a sense of urgency in his voice. "How did you get the shard?" Jack cackled his horrid, wretched laugh.
Oh, that! I'd almost forgotten. We had a doctor come to the shelter a week or two back. He's some young sort volunteering to help the homeless, that sort of rot. They saw my scars and said that I still had things in the wounds. Foreign objects, they called them. So they sat me down and they pulled that thing out of my head. From right between the eyes. See this cut here? Been in there 40 years or more.
Jo turned, dread and horror swelling inside her as she looked at the shard in the box, the shard with the staring, hateful eye, the shard that she now knew had been lodged in Jack Stone's skull for 40 years. In the light from under the corridor, the eye didn't look like a mass of dark patches anymore. It was alive, pulsing, blinking, seething with a rage that burned into Jo's soul. The noise from outside was deafening now. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Jo pulled away from the useless lock, sinking to the ground, her back against the wall, hot tears stinging the corners of her eyes as she cowered in the shadows. There was so much noise in the room now. It was in your head all this time? Bill's voice marvelled in astonishment. Jack laughed. It was, lad. You could say it really was all in my head. Jo sobbed in terror. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. The interference on the tape was building higher and higher. The voices of Jack and Bill being swallowed forever by the disintegrating recording. Jo could just about discern the last few sentences of the interview before, with a polite bleep and a click, the door to the tape room swung open in a burst of light. What was on the plate, Jack? The one that got stuck in your head? Bill asked. Oliver Cromwell, said Jack, his voice vanishing into the static. And I'll tell you this for nothing, lad, that he had the ugliest face that I've ever seen. London's Burning was written and performed by Isaac Hart. The music was by Kevin MacLeod, with thanks to the proofreaders for the generous donation of their time. Ghost in the Museum will return with a new original story in October. Thank you for listening. May we meet again.